The Alliance for Charitable Reform is a project of the Philanthropy Roundtable that educates legislators and policymakers about the central role of private giving in American life and the importance of protecting philanthropic freedom. I'm Marcus Chavez, Communications Director for the Alliance for Charitable Reform. Today I'm joined by Dr. Patrick Rooney, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Research at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University, which is the organization that conducts the research and writes the annual Giving USA report, correct?
Exactly.
Dr. Rooney, you're also a member of the newly formed ACR Advisory Council as well.
Yes,
so I want to take a moment to thank you for doing that and also joining us to talk about the Giving USA report and other issues related to philanthropy.
Great.
Well, let me ask you about some of the overall giving numbers. The report stated that total giving this year, or for 2013, was $335.17 billion, which is an increase of 4.4%. We see that individual giving accounted for 72% of that giving, and if you add in the bequests, that number rises to 80%. So my question for you is, could you address the significant role that individual giving plays in the total giving in the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, and Marcus, in fact, the role of individuals is even bigger than that, because about 45% of the foundation grant making comes from family foundations. So when you add in about half of that, and the bequest giving and the household giving from those who are living, it's almost 87%, 88% of total giving comes from individuals who are alive either through their household checkbook or their family foundation checkbook, or those who have recently passed. So I'm not really one for rounding, but if you round, 9 out of every $10 is coming from households and individuals. So it really, when you think about it from a philanthropy perspective, when you think about it from a fundraising perspective, it really is about the relationships with individuals and their families and their charities and things that they're passionate about.
All right. What about some of the giving to the individual recipient organizations? We see that religion was the highest recipient organization at 31%, education at 16%, human services at 12%, and gifts to foundations at 11%. However, when you look at the actual trends, we see that giving to religion slightly declined or held steady. But we see that giving to education rose by 8.9%, public society rose by 8.5%, and arts and culture rose by 7.8%. So would you be able to address some of the trends that we're seeing in giving to these individual recipient organizations?
Sure.
And are we able to glean reasons as to why or why not these trends are occurring?
Sure. I think if you look at kind of the longer term trend for giving to religion, you see a statistical pun, a secular path down in terms of 55% of total giving 40 years ago went to religious organizations. And for about 20 years, that was the norm. It was over half. For the last several years, it's been more like a third. For the last, if you go back to 2000, giving to religion has been more likely to be flat or decline than it has been to increase. And it's only increased more than 2% in 1 year since 2000 in inflation-adjusted dollars. So if you look at giving to religion, you have to say this is a subsector that has seen maybe its peak. Now maybe that's an overstatement. That all said, the role of religion in philanthropy is understated by giving to religion. So giving to religion only counts giving to mass, mosque, synagogue, right? It's not counting my gift to Notre Dame or a gift to a Jewish hospital or other religiously affiliated organizations. So that would be an education gift or a healthcare gift. A gift to the United Way might be motivated by religious values. So it's very hard to capture the true impact of religious values. However, if you're fundraising for a formal organization of worship, you have to look at this data and say, this is somewhat disturbing. When you look at education, education is a big winner, and when the stock market's doing well, giving to education does well. We track in a separate study gifts of $1 million or more that are publicly reported. Higher ed routinely gets 45 to 55% of those gifts, and K through 12 education gets another 10% or so. So a lot of people feel like their alma mater played an important role in their life, and they want to give back or pay it forward, however you think about that. So education is a big beneficiary of the economic recovery. Similarly, given to arts, waned substantially during the Great Recession. And during the Great Recession, a lot of households said, I want to be more concerned, and foundation said, I want to be more concerned about feeding the hungry and housing the homeless. And so they reallocated part of their philanthropic portfolio, whether that was their household checkbook or their family foundation. Now, as the recovery has, I won't say is booming, but as has been plugging along for the last several years, we see many households are reallocating their philanthropic portfolio to more closely reflect their passions historically. So more giving is going to the arts, more is going to education, more is going to the environment, and you see kind of a steady state for religious giving. But I think giving to human services has grown this last year, but not as rapidly as some of these other subsectors.
Okay. One of the points that I wanted to ask you about in this report, total giving as a percentage of GDP at 2%, and that's actually kind of where it's been at for the last several years, for the last decade. However, the report states that in the last decade, charitable giving accounted for 3.5% of overall growth in GDP. Now, if you take that statistic and you factor in the point that the nonprofit sector makes up roughly about 10% of the nation's economy, that makes a pretty strong case for the economic viability and necessity of the nonprofit sector, does it not?
Yeah. So there's these competing tensions. So if you look at just the pure philanthropic aspect of it, we seem to be stuck on the dial at 2%. And I think one of the questions is, what's the value-added proposition the philanthropic sector needs to bring to society to move that from 2 to 4 to 5, much less the biblical tithe of 10%, right? At the same time, total employment in the nonprofit sector has grown more rapidly than employment in manufacturing, and employment in services, employment in government, and so on over the last, if you look at any long period of time, 20 years, 30 years, and so on. And I think it's been a counter-cyclical balance. The Great Recession would have been even worse had the philanthropic sector been as vulnerable to the employment swings as the private sector was. So I think there's some benefit to having the nonprofit sector to think about it from an economic development perspective, but also to think about it as a stabilizing force in society in many different dimensions.
All right. We've actually seen a rise in new methods of giving, particularly online giving. Can you address some of that trend as well?
Yeah, I think this is one of these intergenerational transfer issues, because what I see from my adult children is they shop online, they bank online, they do research online, they give online. And then when I look at my own behavior, I do research online, but I don't buy online and I don't give online for the most part. I will, but only if pressed. And so I think that, and I think for my parents, they probably don't give online at all. So I think there's this generational change. I do think that for charities, it's imperative, though, that you have lots of opportunities to give now, either online or through mobile apps and so on, because this is going to become an ever more important giving vehicle or methodology for giving. I think one of the things that the nonprofit sector has to pay attention to, those the texting giving, that are giving by texting, may lower the average gift amount. So when we've seen the disaster giving in the past, before the texting was an option, we saw that the average gift was over $100, and the median gift was $50 for 911, Katrina, the tsunami, and so on. And we did studies of those. Now, we haven't done a study of the Haiti relief giving or any of the more recent disaster givings where texting was a phenomenon. But I have to believe that when people are texting, it's one and done, right? That they're giving $10, or $15, whatever that amount is, and they've done their thing, and they move on. I think online giving is probably not exactly like that, but that I think for most people, their online gift is probably going to be a smaller dollar amount. So if I'm going to give you a 6-figure gift or more, I'm probably not going to do that on my credit card online. And so I think the role of face-to-face fundraising and face-to-face giving is still important, particularly for major gifts and planned gifts and so on. But there's no denying the growing importance of online giving, and charities need to be well prepared for that.
Interesting. Well, as I mentioned earlier, you are a member of the newly formed ACR Advisory Council, so I want to ask you a couple questions, policy related.
Sure.
In this report, it states that giving from community foundations rose by 10.54%. We've seen a significant rise in popularity of donor-advised funds over the last 10, 20 years. Does this report factor that in at all, or what does it say about that trend?
Yeah, so donor advised funds gets captured a couple places in our report, including the public society benefit that's where the profitable owned donor advised funds, so the Fidelity, Schwab, and so on, are located. Donor advised funds, I think, play an important role in terms of being a way for people to move from kind of their checkbook giving to making a larger investment in philanthropy, and also allows people to have anonymity if they want in their giving, and it also allows people to do multi-year planning. So if you have some extra cash, either from stock transactions or sale of a firm or something like that, you may want to make an investment in the philanthropic sector, but you're not ready where to make it. And for tax reasons or planning reasons, you want to put that cash in a philanthropic investment now, but then decide later where to put it. So maybe put it in a community foundation, donor advised fund, or a for-profit one. But nonetheless, that allows you to reallocate that over time and to give it to multiple sources or multiple uses from that single source. I'm a little concerned with the CAM proposal that that will kill off major incentives to create donor advised funds and to make additional investments in existing ones. Some people think that all those dollars would go into family foundations, and that's one of the justifications for that. I think that's a little naive, because I think the setup cost for a family foundation, the fixed costs, are substantially higher than for a donor advised fund, and so you miss an intermediate step, and I think the donor advised funds provide at least an intermediate step for some people.
I think there's a clear correlation that the health of the economy does factor into the rise or decline of charitable giving. However, is it also not fair to say that charitable giving incentives such as the charitable deduction also have a significant role in which they play in sustaining and or increasing charitable giving?
Yeah, Marcus. So one of the things we see is there's a very strong correlation between changes in personal income, changes in the stock market, changes in GDP with different sources of giving. So we know that the economy changes how much people give and when they give, and it has an impact on that. But people are giving because they want to, and they're giving as a sense of altruism. Now, at the same time, public policy can have an impact. So if you look at, I'm an economist, and economists study what's called the tax price elasticity of demand, which simply means how responsive are philanthropic gifts and giving patterns to changes in tax rates or the tax code. And one of the things we see is that there are responses. Okay, so people are not giving because of the tax code. That would be irrational. If you only care about yourself, you just keep it all for yourself. At the same time, when you change the top marginal tax rate, if you raise that, that lowers the price of giving. So it increases the incentive to give. If you lower the top marginal tax rate, it reduces the price. Increases the price of giving, it reduces the incentive to give, and so that tends to reduce giving in the very short run. Now, whether or not the long run effects, create more income from the tax cuts, or whether or not the tax price effects are stronger, is more complicated. But in the short run, we can measure it pretty accurately. I do think it's important to say, like some of these changes in the Kent proposal, if you move the top, all but the top 5% into non-itemization status, I think that's very worrisome in the sense of, for example, I'm not giving because of the tax code, but like most rational individuals, I take the full benefit of the tax deduction, and it allows me to give more. In a sense, I can give more with those same dollars because I can give out of the after-tax dollars. And so I think it does have an impact. And if you look at how much donors give and how much itemizers give and how much non-itemizers give, on average, itemizers give substantially more than non-itemizers, even after you control for differences in income. So there are effects that matter. Some of our faculty members are working on a paper that looks at what happens to philanthropy when people move from itemization status to non-itemization status, and they find very consistent results that being able to deduct your donations has an impact. Historically, we've had donor deductions for almost as long as we've had the tax code, and I think it's a public value, historical policy value that says philanthropy and charities play an important role in our society, and in many ways they serve as a substitute for government. And so it may be better than government in some cases, it may be worse than government in some cases, but it's a substitute and allows us to experiment and support the safety net and do other governmental activities that in a more decentralized, disorganized in some ways, but a more decentralized, creative manner and a much more localized manner with greater flexibility. And so I think to the extent that we kill off incentives to give, we may be killing the golden goose.
Okay. Well, you mentioned a little bit about the studies that you guys are doing on looking at itemizers when they move into a non-itemized category. Are there any other studies that you have, whether looking at the CAM proposal or any other studies on the horizon?
We haven't started anything yet to formally analyze the CAM proposal, but one of the things we'd be interested in looking at is can you model what would happen to donor advised funds? Can you model what would happen if you move that all but that top 5% to non-itemization status? That's an important threshold. You know, if you look at the IRS tax data, there's a disproportionate share that come from the top 1%, the top 1/10 of 1%, but that middle group that is currently itemizers and has tax itemization status, if you move them to non-itemization status, that's an important group of donors. If you coalesce that with a floor of 2%, then that's also going to reduce the number of people who are getting the full benefit of making a charitable donation from a tax perspective. Now, a lot of people are already non-itemizers, right? And many of them still give. And so for them, it costs $1 to donate $1. And that would continue if you increase the non-itemizer group. But what we've seen is that people do respond to incentives. People are rational. They're not giving because of the tax benefit, but it may affect how much they give, when they give, and if you provide incentives to give to one type of organization or another, it may affect where they give.
Well, thank you for taking a few minutes to discuss some of these sometimes complicated issues. You're able to break them down in a way that's easier to understand. So thank you very much, and I look forward to talking to you in the future.
Great, thank you.